We advise the opinions and views of the hosts and guests do not reflect those of the station.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Philippines Uncut. I'm your host, Buddy Kunanan. Now, in this show, we're going to do something different. We're going to talk about one of the saddest, most tragic events in history, the Holocaust. We're going to talk about its roots, its bearing on society, and how it's continuing to shape the world we live in. And we're also going to talk about how the Philippines played a significant role in saving so many Jews from certain death during World War II. And joining us in our discussion tonight is a very eminent guest, a very distinguished guest, Dr. Rachel Wyman. She's an expert on interreligious relations. Good evening, Dr. Wyman. Welcome to Philippines Uncut.
Thank you, buddy. I appreciate you inviting me.
No, it's an honor to have you here, especially given your work in the field of religious tolerance and genocide prevention and interreligious dialogue. Thank you very much, ma'am. Now, let's talk about your background, Dr. Wyman. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
You don't have to call me commander. I received the Order of La Candula from your government in 2005, which was a great honor to me. Very important for me when you are recognized by the work you're doing, that it has a ripple effect, that people then want to know more. And it was wonderful for me because my work since I was 20 or so, in the last 35 years, has been answering children's questions, young people's questions about where is God when there's evil. About when does human beings stand up and be counted against it? How do you find the risk? How do you have the courage and take the risks that are necessary to fight true bullying on the playground? And then those little same bullies grow up to be big bullies, and they're on the playground of life in the global war. And then they have fancy and expensive weapons. They're able to motivate a larger group of people. They can take over governments. They can start martial law or take over power. We see it every day and all the time. And we see how the minorities in those communities, those who are considered to be the outsiders, those who are not let in, that are not part of the large-scale majority, are always the first victims and always those that will be most vulnerable to stereotyping, to scapegoating, and to destruction.
Yes. What led you to this field?
As a Jew, I would use the terminology that the Nobel Peace Prize winner, the great author Elie Wiesel, who was a 13, 14-year-old boy in the Holocaust, said, not all victims were Jews, but all Jews were victims. And it would have been my family, just because of geography, it wasn't my family, because the Nazis conquered more than 22 different nations.
Okay.
And my parents were children or teenagers in the United States. So I felt that was my story, my legacy, and I shouldn't ask survivors or their children to tell the story.
Yes.
I had the privilege of not having to be there. My father was, in fact, an American soldier, fighting alongside Filipinos and others against the evil aggressors as an American Jewish soldier, but as a soldier in the American Army. He experienced all kinds of things where he felt that Dwight Eisenhower, who was the great commander, who actually was here for a while before that.
With MacArthur.
Yes. And
MacArthur's deputy or administrator.
Right. Yes, and the one who, in fact, had Manuel Quezon, the president's ear, and had his heart in many ways. But he went on to become a supreme commander before he became president of the United States. And he said, sometimes people don't always know what they're fighting for. But this war, everyone knows what they're fighting against.
Yes.
And they're fighting against it. There's images that were shown at the very beginning before you started, because in the 20th century, we came into a modernization, industrialization, a post-enlightenment that said that anybody could be anything they want, but no repudiation, no responsibility, no accountability. We see that anybody who feels disaffected, Germans felt disaffected after World War I, lost it badly, had been losing for a long time.
Very demoralized, very down on their luck as well.
Forced into democracy. They did not assume democracy willingly. It was forced upon them by the
And it failed?
It failed because
given the circumstances.
It never started.
Yes.
It really never started in a real sense of the word. The Weimar Republic was very short. And during that time, the most dysfunctional and disenfranchised people could speak out, from the right and from the left, from communism all the way to fascism.
The far right, sure.
Fascism took hold in Franco, Spain. It took hold in Mussolini.
If you think about it, I mean, the Weimar Republic really didn't have a chance, given, as you said, the left was pulling at it, the right was pulling at it, and both sides tried to undermine it from within.
And there wasn't enough of a majority inside that knew what they really wanted.
Yes.
All they know is they didn't feel good. And feeling good is a very strange, pursuit of happiness, not understanding that, in fact, what they did was actually destroy their own credibility for generations to come.
Yes. Before we go into Dr. Wyman, let's talk about your work, because your work is not, I mean, I looked at your bio, and it seems that you're spread out over a lot of places. You work with the Kurdistan region government in Iraq, with the Genocide Survivors Network in Rwanda. You also work, you do considerable work involving the three monotheistic faiths, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Who is Dr. Wyman? I mean, there's so many fields of expertise here.
Well, I was told by those people who know me that I don't eat and I don't sleep. And as you see, very little time to exercise, too. But everything else has to do with this search for, first of all, where the most difficult, most horrifying places that took place, not to study that, not to study the genocides that took place. Genocide was the Genocide Convention was created by Raphael Lemkin, who's was an American Jew at the time, but he escaped from Poland. All his family was wiped out. He wanted to just put a name to what does that mean when every single member of your community is targeted, from the smallest baby born a day, or even in utero, all the way to the oldest grandma and grandpa.
By virtue of their existence,
By virtue that they're different.
Yes.
By virtue that they're considered outsiders in an insider community. By a way of trying to blame everything or scapegoat everything on your minorities, then you begin to say, well, it's not our fault, why we're not a super race, why we're not so powerful, why power is taken away, why they want lands back, how they can rebuild their country, why they don't want to listen to when the rest of the world said no more armament. So they look to say, well, what went wrong? If we're so great, which that's their first point.
How could this have happened?
Yeah, how could this have happened? And start
Someone
looking
has
for
to
others.
blame.
Their first problem was they're not so great. At least they're no greater than anybody else. That's democracy. When you're no greater than, you're great, but you're no greater than anybody else.
Yes.
Democracy is recognizing that moment in time, that every individual, every baby that's born is valuable and special, and should be treated that way, no matter what color they are, no matter what abilities they have, and no matter what community they belong to.
And here lies really the root of the Holocaust. What happened, and I mean, what continues to happen in many parts of the world. Now,
so you asked me about the
yes.
other genocides. I believe that after so it'll be 75 years next year. 75 years will be the beginning of the Holocaust. Many people are still alive that were 75 years old, and certainly we know people who are 75 years old. So this is not so far away. At that moment in time, the most educated, or at least according to paperwork, most literate community that had access to a lot more than most communities around the world had at that time, decided industrialized killing. Decided to put everybody aside. And I decided that even that leap of using the ingenuity of mankind for evil, we have to do everything we can to see who are the people who stop them. Can we find role models in them? Can we find we find a powerful legacy?
Yes. Dr. Wyman, let's define first what the Holocaust was for our viewers, because you'd be surprised. A lot of people, I mean, it's been 75 years, as you mentioned, but a lot of people really these days, are still unaware of what exactly happened during the Holocaust and what the Holocaust was all about.
It's not only today we live in a global world. We always lived in a global world. It's just our awareness of what's happening on other corners and pieces to other people that normally don't seem to be connected to us. You had a lot to worry about here as you were in those years in the 30s of trying to decide what does a commonwealth turn into a nation. You are struggling with your own identity. Of course, the Japanese were taking over, the Chinese, whatever is going on the east side, who was caring or really acknowledging what was happening elsewhere? And so far, your school system has reflected that. When the Holocaust is part of World War II, which is a global war of 55 million people being killed.
Yes.
And that World War was based on two basic ideas: dictatorship or fascism, and racism. The word racism itself is a strange word because there really are no races, but there are racism.
Yes, yes.
Because none of us are different races. We really are just the same family, the same group of people, no matter what color our skin is or hair color or anything else involved in our physical autonomy. But what is important to realize, and this is where the crucial thing happens, buddy, where people don't understand, is the fact that how easy and how delicate the world is, that through anger and frustration, through fear, it will motivate people to do very bad things for a very long time. And what we have to realize is that if we come to terms with why did you get from this place to that place, there's no intellectual reasoning, there's no rational reasoning, there's no evidence otherwise. So you realize that critical thinking is really not part of it.
Yes, yes.
Emotional intelligence doesn't exist.
Yes,
and most of the reasons of the prejudiced mind comes from fear and comes from hate.
And ignorance.
Ignorance is a third piece.
It's the third piece of the puzzle.
And the hate, I just want to mention that hate comes from anger here.
Sure.
We find, and you can go from the smallest, again, always bring everything down. Nations, people think nations don't behave like people. Nations are people, and they reflect the individual. So you'll see
the psyche of the individual.
So the psyche of the individual, of a very angry and dysfunctional and powerless man, and particularly in his own home, there's a lot of abuse of his children and wife because he's so powerless elsewhere.
You know, it makes the hair on the back of my head stand up, because what you're describing is actually Adolf Hitler almost. I mean, for those who know World War II history and how it all developed in Hitler's life, this is exactly what Hitler was: a very angry, disenchanted, frustrated man who somehow made it to the top of the German nation.
The somehow was the very easy part. Industrialists and businessmen said he's crazy, but he makes people feel good. We can control him. Maybe not a puppet government, but it's a coalition of forces. He never got the majority rule. He never got the majority number. As soon as the first elections, he canceled all other elections.
Yes.
I mean, we can see that everywhere.
Sure.
Other people are getting elected democratically now and canceling everything and doing martial rule.
And the end product of this was really the Holocaust, which was the extermination of 6 million Jews. The
ultimate story is the extermination of 6 million Jews. But the Holocaust is, in fact, the genocide that was specifically defined and set up against the Jews of Europe. Because in Christian Europe at the time, though there were Muslims in parts of Europe, Catholic and Protestant communities, together over that period of time, there were not many people of other colors at that point. Today, Europe looks very different than it did in the 30s. The only real others that were part of community that were invited in after the Napoleonic time were the Jews that were living there anyway. all the time. And for the first time, the Jews can also be part of a larger, wonderful world, diversity and ideas of equality and people achieving for their character and their ability, not for any other reason. And every single thing that the Jews were accused of, quote unquote, accused of by Mein Kampf, of Hitler's book and of Hitler's, of the Nazi theory, is all the things that you and I think most Filipinos would hold wonderful. He accused the Jews of democracy. You see, democracy is an evil word to Nazis because democracy means that every human being is valuable and their voice. So how could you say you and I are valuable if you're trying to say that you're
that this minority is to blame for their lot in life? Yes.
And if you have an idea of Ubermensch, which is the supermen, then the other layers of unacceptable or blue-collar workers or people like you and I, Asian and Jew, would be at the very bottom. And the Jews of Europe had to be cited out as the reason that, that Europe is not functioning today. It doesn't look European anymore.
Yes, yes.
And every single increment of anything that looked from not only a Jewish perspective and sound, but also that the Jews were accused of bringing in black African ideals, jazz, that horrible sound, according to the Nazis, which is they forbid the saxophone, they forbid zebras, and they forbid zoos. And so you say Jews, zebras, and saxophones. What do we have in common? That's the way the Nazis thought, because they felt you could regulate human beings, you can regulate botany, you can regulate music, you can regulate art, and they called it all degenerate, anything that was not European grown and delivered.
You know, Dr. Wyman, what really gets me sometimes, gets me thinking, is that how could a people as intelligent, as cultured as, let's say, the German people of that time even, be drawn into this whole, this whole way of thinking that's really immoral?
There's always the first response that I say when somebody, like a good man like you, asks a question. You don't know intelligent people that do stupid things?
Guilty as charged. Okay.
I would like you to also talk about anybody, just because you have a degree in any university makes you a higher, more moral human being, male or female?
Yes, it doesn't follow.
So we already set ourselves up for failure because our assumption is that just because you have a college degree makes you a better person, or you can understand information better than anybody else. And in fact, those who opposed Hitler and the Nazis came from every walk of life, believers and non-believers, men and women in the cloth, from Catholic and Protestant and Muslim places. Like I said, there's this corner of Albania and what we now know as Serbia, Bosnia, still had some Muslims there. Men of the cloth and people that had no belief, people that were very wealthy and people who had no money, people who had education and people who didn't. So we began to look, and this was my research for the last 30 years, look for human beings who stand up against evil.
Yes.
Who are people who ultimately took the courageous and risky part of looking at what I would call the playground in chaos, where the bully is bullying others, a few other cronies of his are on the side, and everybody else is watching as a victim gets victimized.
Sure. And some people point out that the Nazis actually were a minority in Germany, that a great majority of the people weren't really Nazis, but were perhaps powerless to stand up, or maybe lack the courage. I don't know. I mean, what do you think, Doctor?
It's interesting you say they're powerless. Powerless is the way that you identify yourself in the world. You have power if you take some responsibility and do something. You're powerless if you think that you have no power. But most people have power. They just don't know how to utilize it.
But if I were German and I stood up against Hitler and his hordes back then, I would have been sent off to the concentration camp as well. Then that would be the end of me.
There are those who were, and that did happen.
It did happen.
That's true.
Yes.
But you can also, a German, get out of concentration camp. Germans got out of concentration camp because the idea is to rehabilitate you. So, and not only could you migrate or whatever, but you could try to, there are many times that they check to see, is it true that everyone who was part of the killing, particularly the very first element of killing, the first was lining people up and shooting them down, and particularly in the border in Ukraine and Lithuania. And that was done by regular troops. It was even done by police departments. You say every single policeman is evil? Could every single policeman do that without questioning? Well, of course, they gave them a lot of extra vodka and other things to make it a little easier for them. But there were people who said, no, that's not what I want to do. That's not why I came to this army or why I'm a police officer, and asked for different duty, and they were given different duty.
Yes,
so there was a possibility to ask. There was a possibility to be relocated. Yes, this is an easy job. Pointing guns at children and women is easy.
Yes.
Being out in the winter fighting against the Soviet army is much tougher.
Yes, yes.
So who was going to volunteer to do that when they could do an easy job, which is taking civilians and killing them?
Yes, yes. Because I mean that's an excuse. A lot of people after the war, the Germans said that we had no choice. We were following orders. We had no choice. Otherwise, if we didn't follow orders, we would have been shot as well. So.
Well, very little evidence has shown that that's really happened. It's number one. But number two, that's why I do the search I do for those who stood up, because it showed that there were choices. And there were even choices, some of them, many of them, were choices that did sacrifice their life. But they said, when you look at this experience of the Holocaust and the Nazi perpetration of this great evil on all mankind, because it's not who your victim is, it's how you now see yourself as a human being. It now has how you identify with God and everything else. So that person who's doing these atrocious acts has destroyed himself in the eyes of his children forever.
Yes, yes.
And he's destroyed his country for assuming that kind of role. And if you're powerful enough to say no to some aspect of it, to stop it, that would be much greater. And when we interviewed actual people we call righteous Gentiles, non-Jews that were not targeted, were the bystanders in the playing yard. They weren't Jewish by what they called race, by having 3 grandparents that make you Jewish. You weren't doing anything different than the rest of the norm people. And you had a choice to say stop it, or that's wrong, or take a child and bring them into your house, or do thousands of choices that you could have had that you chose not to. So we say that choosing not to is a choice too.
Yes, yes.
And those who did choose, and that's the study we made, were people that said, what is happening now, this craziness that's going on now, by this thing that is a good place for Philippines, but snowballed out of proportion to everything. Where are we when we were saying? Where did we when we allowed all of the Jews to be be kicked out of the faculty in the school, wherever children and people were? Where were we when they were burning books that we couldn't read that we loved? Where were we when they told us we couldn't listen to jazz or swing?
Do you think if more people had come out and spoken openly against all these things being done, that
Absolutely.
this could have been averted? That
Hitler
could have been
anticipated your question.
Checkmated.
Absolutely. It's watching someone get to the cookie jar. If you told a child, those cookies are those tasty things are after dinner, don't touch it, and you have the cookie jar right there, and then everyone's watching as the child is going and thinking it's cute or thinking that interesting or seeing how is he going to achieve that. But if everyone says to call him out and put the cookie jar far away, but also say we're watching you. We're watching you. We have ideals. We have made standards. We want you to have the vegetables first, whatever it is. I don't want to compare people to the cookie jar, but I'm comparing watching and being vigilant.
Sure.
Most of the times, any really good legislation around the world that is passed, there's a group of people that are just looking to upend a bad legislation or destroy good legislation. We see that over and over again around the world, that you have to be vigilant in what you hold dear. Standards of behavior, human identity, what you want out of your church, what you want out of your community.
It's about taking a stand, really. And it really proves the saying correct. The only way for evil to win is for good men or good women to do nothing.
Yes, that's correct. I mean, Martin Luther King said that. He said it after he heard a Rabbi Joachim Prince say something similar to that, who was the rabbi of Berlin, who was able to escape to America.
Dr. Wyman, it's been 75 years since the Holocaust. Do you see any closure to this happening anytime soon?
The closure, and that's why we're labeling this the lessons of the Holocaust, will only happen when it stops happening. And that's why you asked me earlier, I'm all over the place, but the legacy of the Jewish people, which I have, I think, the privilege to be a member of. I think it's wonderful to be a Jew any time of the world, even during that time. I'd rather be a Jew than a Nazi.
Absolutely.
Right?
I'd rather be a dog than a Nazi.
There's lots of reasons why
absolutely,
we would say,
absolutely.
and all my life I felt this way, that we should all be proud of who we are and what we bring to this world and,
I
the
mean
ideas.
the analogy being I'd rather be not even human. I'd rather be than being a Nazi.
Understood, and you're absolutely right. I understood what you know,
yes.
and I think when we think of those kinds of ways, that anything but that I would ever be a part of a hateful movement. So I looked at where other genocides have taken place, and places that we may have heard of, but we had no engagement with, like even Cambodia, which is near here, under the Pol Pot regime. But the places that I did pay attention to, because our people actually came to my doorstep saying, we want to learn from you the Jewish experience in the Holocaust, the other word Holocaust, Shoah, of the murder of 6 million Jews, and what do you do beyond that? How do you give testimony? How do you not become hateful? How do you not become revengeful? These are the people from Kurdistan who were gassed by in northern Iraq. The Sunni Muslim against Sunni Muslim, but two ethnic groups. So under Saddam Hussein, it was to murder the Iraqi Kurds.
I guess that's a big challenge for you. How to, as you said, end it, at the same time not creating, hateful feelings on the other side, on the side of the people who were abused, who were killed, who were dehumanized.
To see
that's
that things, it is, and then what you do is you see that things should work. In other words, the perpetrator should be taken to justice and be held in court, go to world court or whatever court one does, stand before a tribunal and be punished for it and be accountable. There's so much impunity around the world that people can do evil things and never get caught or never called out, and certainly continue to live a nice, healthy life even where they are.
Yes.
And we have to make sure that justice is served. We have to know that it's taught in our schools, not only as a cautionary tale, but as a real experience of it's human history.
Yes, yes.
And in our shared history that other human beings around the other side of the globe did this to other people. And then we see in Rwanda, Catholic against Catholic, both by and large are mostly Christians. And the Tutsis were wiped out, 800,000 of them were wiped out in 100 days by their neighbors. Right? People didn't even know if they were Tutsi or Hutu. They had to show up an identity card.
Yes, yes.
Because people looked the same,
Yes,
really looked
yes.
the same. And so the idea that violence upon violence by people that just don't want, in their mind, there's no such thing as power sharing. There is no such thing as your lovely ladies possibly, intermarrying with my
Not inclusive,
handsome,
not inclusive at all. Yes.
So as I said, when the Nazis accused Jews of democracy, they were really saying that we are, because they just used the word Jew arbitrarily for anything they didn't like. And some people do that today, because that becomes a symbol to them.
Yes,
If you
yes.
want to heap something. So it was democracy, but also there was the attitude that Jews on purpose gave the Gentile world Jesus.
Yes.
I don't remember doing that on purpose, but that because Jesus is that kind and generous, turn your other cheek kind of fellow. And what Nazi in his right mind would use that as a role model for your children, that
Yes.
image of Jesus of Nazareth walking the Galilee like that.
Yes.
So it's as if we on purpose thought about it so that would placate all the Roman Empire and anybody else that comes from it. And the other accusations are equally ludicrous and don't make any sense. And all of it has to do with, at the same time, just trying to label otherness so that once you label and then put stars on someone or do something different to them, then you start saying there's insiders and outsiders. And in order to be part of my inside group, you have to belong and become a member of the Nazi party.
Yes, Dr. Wyman, hold that thought because we have to pause for a break. Guys, don't go away because a few moments, remembering the Holocaust, the lessons of the Holocaust, and Philippines Uncut returns. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Philippines Uncut. I'm your host, Buddy Kunanan. Now, in this show, we're going to do something different. We're going to talk about one of the saddest, most tragic events in history, the Holocaust. We're going to talk about its roots, its bearing on society, and how it's continuing to shape the world we live in. And we're also going to talk about how the Philippines played a significant role in saving so many Jews from certain death during World War II. And joining us in our discussion tonight is a very eminent guest, very distinguished guest, Dr. Rachel Wyman. She's an expert on interreligious relations. Good evening, Dr. Wyman. Welcome to Philippines Uncut.
Thank you, buddy. I appreciate you inviting me.
No, it's an honor to have you here, especially given your work in the field of religious tolerance and genocide prevention and interreligious dialogue. Thank you very much, ma'am. Now, let's talk about your background, Dr. Wyman. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
We advise the opinions and views of the hosts and guests do not reflect those of the station.